Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. Our neighborhood is widely acknowledged to be a pretty tough one. Perhaps not as tough as what we've seen in parts of West Asia and even Africa. And I'm not even referring to Pakistan here, since it's not germane to the discussion or to this program. I'm referring to a couple of other small neighbors who I collectively refer to them as the troublesome threesome. And I have a small graphic to show you to identify who these three countries are and why they are troublesome. So there you have it: Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, each presenting their own set of problems vis-a-vis India. So what is it at play here? Is it national interest? Obviously, that is an element here. It could also be perhaps a sense of disquiet over India's size and dominance of this region. It could be about concerns that have been expressed in the past that India would try and annex them, although that is, of course, not quite true. And if you also look at it, it could also be a case of smart politics, trying to take on a bigger neighbor is always plays out well in the streets, as we have seen. And let me go down to our guest for this evening, Ambassador Vivek Katju. Many of you would know of him. You have seen him before. He was one of our joint secretaries handling the neighborhood many, many years ago when he was in service. And he's been monitoring and writing extensively on the neighborhood for quite some time. So, good evening and welcome.
Thank you.
So, when I look at a country like Nepal, for instance, this constant need to, this dalliance with China, the flirtation with the Chinese ambassador of Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli, and this constant need to kind of keep India on the back foot or guessing. What do you attribute this to?
Look, if you permit, I'll try to give you a little chapeau before we come to individual countries.
Yeah.
Uh, if you see historically, the political elites in all these countries have had a certain wariness about Delhi. I think part of it is on account of what you mentioned, India's size. And somehow the political elites in these states feel that they can define their nationhood uh, n- not through cooperation with India, but in some kind of keeping India at a distance, etc. So that is one side of the picture. The other side of the picture is a desire to cooperate with India, naturally in areas which are of advantage to them. And the third side, there's a third facet, and that facet is to try to try to get some other foreign power in to to reduce the distance that there is in power terms between India and them. This, if you plot a graph from 1947, you will find this as a constant.
Mm.
There was earlier the colonial state, of course, but after 1947, there was a dalliance at various times with the Americans and the Western powers, etc. And India has always been a little wary of this for obvious reasons. And India's approach has been to tell them that, look, you have no worries from us. We are not interested in interfering with your internal affairs, but we do have a concern about our security, and that you can expect that if our security feels threatened, we will take corrective action. So I've always felt that there's need for a kind of introspection on both sides, both on India's side, but more on the side of the political elites of these countries, so that a kind of understanding can be reached where India respects them and they respect us. And while respecting us, they understand that if India's security interests are jeopardized, then naturally India would take action. Otherwise, it is for them to decide whatever systems they want, their internal politics, etc., are really things for them to decide. We are not concerned. But uh, somehow the other, there's a certain reflexive approach when it comes to India. It's almost ingrained, and that needs in these countries, and that needs to be reduced. And they on their part must do some introspection.
Do they? You mentioned the word respect. Is there a lack of respect for us? Do they? I mean, would you define that, sir?
No, I don't think that there is. It's a very difficult word to define. You see, there was a time, if you see in the 50s and 60s, when some of these countries were economically doing quite well. They were Sri Lanka, for instance, and there was a feeling that there's this large giant which is flailing around, which still hasn't got its act together. Uh, but I think that period has passed. So there is a growing recognition among them that India is emerging. India has problems, but it is emerging on the global stage as a major power and with major interests. And yet, there are these reflexive elements of wanting to assert their own quote unquote independence, that we are not your creatures, we are not subservient. And I don't think there's anyone's desire in India to treat them with any kind of disrespect. The only minimum that India, I think, wants is that you should understand that we too have red lines, and that if our security in particular feels threatened, then we will look after ourselves. And the second point I'll make is that there is almost an assumption in these countries that India is in some manner or the other involved in their domestic politics, which is
Yeah.
not true. I don't think there's anyone's desire here to really become a player in their domestic politics. Yet, many of them, in order to project their own importance in their system, want to show a certain affinity or a closeness with India. And that is why sometimes even meetings of our envoys or our representatives or officials or ministers with their politicians is misinterpreted, and all kinds of conspiracy theories are then evolved. And I think that that must end if there is a common understanding reached. Uh, then that will end. But that's not easy. Theoretically, of course, I know that this is easy for me to say. But when you translate it on the ground, then there are complexities. But at least there should be an attempt at this.
So, with respect to Nepal,
Yeah.
uh, it's a fact, isn't it, that in the past there has been a fair amount of perhaps interference or intervention by India in the political processes there.
Uh, I think there was an attempt on the part of various sections of the Nepalese elite to draw India in their own internecine sort of political situation.
Mhm.
I don't think that there was any desire here to become a participant in this.
Mhm.
But wittingly or unwittingly, uh, if we did on some occasions give project that we were closer to one section of Nepalese political elites or
Mhm.
political parties than others, then that is something that we must try to end. Because I'm a firm believer that as long as my interests, that means the country's interests, are served, as long as our interests are protected, uh, the neighbor can do what he likes. He can run his system as he likes.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, being a democracy, we would like democracy to prevail. But the kind of democracy, the variant, is for him. Unless he takes steps that impacts on India's politics. If Sri Lanka takes steps on their ethnic situation which impacts on Indian politics, then naturally there will be a reaction. If in Nepal, on the
Yeah,
Madheshi question, they
yeah,
take a certain view,
yeah.
and there are affinities between the Madheshis and people in India, then it will impact on Indian politics, and there will be a reaction. Hence,
In,
I am
in,
advocating that the time has come for frank conversations so that parameters can be drawn, and that would be uh, to the advantage of everyone.
in the current situation, would you say Nepal's dalliance with China has been a major gripe for us, major irritant?
Naturally, we will be deeply concerned if the Nepalese allow their relations to develop with China in a manner that impact adversely on us. After all, we have open borders with Nepal.
Yeah,
We have a very special relationship with Nepal. That doesn't mean that we want to intervene in their foreign policy. Far from it. But there are certain practical realities which all of us understand. And those practical realities demand that the Nepalese should take our interests into concern even while they develop their ties with China. Uh, the, the world being what it is, we can't tell Nepal that you will not have any relations with China. That's not right. And we've never done it. And I don't think anyone would do it. But certainly, if Nepal starts taking steps which impact on us, like the Maldives, the ex president of Maldives took steps which
yeah.
were designed to provoke us, then there would be trouble.
I'd like to refer to a question by Mohan Vankar here. He says China doesn't have Nepali soldiers in their army. They're tilting towards China so that they can open another front if anything like a blockade happens. Okay, to comment on this, sir?
I don't follow this. They are till so that they can open another front if anything.
I mean,
But
colluding with China.
no, no, no. I understand that. The question is that there is a certain geography.
Hmm,
Now, howsoever they may open up with China, can they overcome the dictates of geography?
yeah,
And the Nepalese know this. I don't think there's any government of India which would like to have any kind of interruption of supplies with Nepal.
yeah.
But they must introspect that what have they done which has led India to take extreme measures? Because uh,
I'd like to
the,
come on to Bangladesh, sir. Now, there are undercurrents of hostility here, even though, at least publicly, there's a lot of friendship in Bonhomie, which is quite evident. The PM travels there. Sheikh Hasina comes here. But there are recurrent undercurrents about the fact that we failed to deliver on Tista. Then there's a sense of injury in Bangladesh over our kind of pro-Myanmar stance when it comes to the Rohingya refugees. Is this? Does this add to fuel the already the sense in Bangladesh that India is that unfair big guy sitting up there, which is taking us for all we are worth?
look, there's a difference in size. If you're sitting in Dhaka and you look at the map,
Yeah,
uh, there would be a certain perception. And I think all Indian statesmen, all Indian diplomats, and the strategic community dealing with Bangladesh is aware of this, and therefore it does take into account Bangladesh's sensitivities. I do think that relations with Bangladesh over the past many years, especially during the Bangladesh's present regime, have been excellent. But again, if you take Bangladesh, and there is a government in Bangladesh, as there was at some stages, which allows its territory to be used in a manner that is prejudicial to Indian interests, then what would India do?
yeah,
Won't India then safeguard its interests? So, The point that I'm making is that I don't think there's been any desire here ever to intervene in Bangladesh's domestic affairs, because it's not to our advantage to do so. The caveat is that the political elite in Bangladesh, whatever particular hue, must come to their own understanding that, look, when it comes to a neighbor like India, if they have sensitivities, so does India. And that we must respect those sensitivities irrespective of who's in power, or irrespective of their domestic politics. And
Do you,
that are the kind of conversations that are now necessary.
on the issue of radicalization, there's a fair amount of that happening in Bangladesh. And given their past history of past regimes there colluding with the Pakistani ISI and all, so those concerns remain valid even today, in your view?
But my feeling is that the Bangladeshi political class should be wary and would be wary of radicalization, uh, because that's not good for them themselves. It's of course for them to decide how their societies are oriented. But
Yeah.
if their society gets oriented in a manner that causes alarm in the neighborhood, then even while it is impacting on Bangladesh itself, that evolution would impact on the neighborhood, and the neighborhood would then take steps to protect interests. I mean, let me give you an analogy, if I may. If supposing there's a little fire which takes place in someone's house and that fire is doused immediately, then that's not the neighbor's concern. But if a fire is there which then tends to spread, the neighbors would naturally be
Absolutely.
wary and would be worried and anxious and would want to contain the fire lest in that house, lest it starts harming them. I'm not saying something extraordinary. This is common sense.
Now, a bite from Ambassador Veena Sikri. She was India's former High Commissioner to Bangladesh many years ago, and she retains an interest in that
Real
country, in the
issues that are
politics over there.
inevitable in the neighborhood between two such close neighbors who share. It's like two people living in the same mohalla together. You always will have some issues, but as long as you look at them positively and together with the same spirit of cooperation and trust, everything can be solved.
Okay, Desh is saying that basically, since we are so close together, virtually in a mahalla kind of a relationship, the those relationships have to be constantly worked on. So no matter how low things may go at some point, if you keep at it, things will improve in the course of time. So I'd like to come on to Sri Lanka now. There's the whole issue of the East Container Terminal and the surrounding it. I understand that India has now been offered the West Container Terminal, although there is an MOU regarding the East Container Terminal. So there seems to be a difference in the way Colombo looks at China and looks at India, even though it is deeply indebted to China. I mean, can you explain just what is going on here?
Project, because I think uh, the intricacies of that project or the full details of the project are never fully in the public domain. So therefore, it's very difficult to make authoritative statements there. But as a general proposition, Sri Lanka uh, at one stage has a certain economic interest in India. It also has economic interests and commercial interests in China. It needs to manage these interests with China in a manner that doesn't cause any red flags to be raised here. This is not a question of infringement of sovereignty of Sri Lanka. This is the way the international system works and has always worked all through history. So if the Sri Lankan elites, of whatever hue, come to an understanding that, look, we will like to align with India, and yet we will not take provocative actions against India. And we will constantly, as Veena correctly said in the context of Bangladesh, keep a dialogue open so that we can explain to Indian representatives our own situation, and Indian representatives on their part could explain their own concerns. Then I think there will be a greater chance for harmony to prevail and misgivings to be addressed. Because, as Modi has said often, and I think correctly, that we want our region to be a participant in India's journey of development. Now, it's a fact that the Chinese today, in terms of development, are far ahead of us. But India too has much to offer to these neighboring countries, and they are conscious of it. The Indian market, if you take a long-term view, will be a very, very significant market. It will, in fact, if I may put it, be their primary market.
Yeah.
And that is the long-term view that I'm suggesting that needs to be adopted by the elites of this country instead of looking upon India as with suspicion. Because in the past, the feeling was that India is hegemonic, that India wants to dominate, it only looks after its interests. I think that period is over.
Mm.
We, uh, it was, if you recollect, Prime Minister Gujral who had so well put it
Yeah.
that we will go the extra mile. But the caveat was that please don't offend our security, because no country will accept that.
There's
So
an
I think,
interesting comment here, sir, from GS. He says on national security issues, there must be a national consensus and no unnecessary politics by opposition parties. How do we bring neighbors in our sphere of influence?
um,
No intervention.
ideally, no, ideally, there should be, even within India, a consensus on foreign policy issues. There will be differences of opinion but the parameters must be set. There can't be uh, domestic politics played on these issues, on issues relating to foreign policy. And foreign policy, as far as I understand, begins with the neighborhood. But
But
then
would,
that is the ideal. And
yeah,
we are living in very contentious, politically very contentious times.
yeah.
But still, at the end of the day, I do think that the Indian political class has the capacity to come to an understanding when India's vital interests get involved. And they've shown it time and again. And what is perhaps needed now, mechanisms for quiet conversations between leading members of the political class. I'm not saying that this is to be government and opposition parties. I'm taking the political class as a whole because in the Indian system, decision making is finally with the political class. So the political class must come to an understanding on basic approaches on foreign policy and security issues. And if that can happen, then we can address these things.
There's another interesting comment from Nero Shan. He says India should prioritize to strengthen the social and cultural ties with people linked to Indian culture instead of diplomatic ties with governments. I don't understand the last bit. But the culture thing is interesting, isn't it, sir?
The culture thing is a very sensitive thing. It's been my experience that all these countries, the neighboring countries, want to have their own cultural identities. And they are very sensitive to any projection that they are an extension of Indian culture. So when we deal with them, we must be conscious that as independent states, they have, whatever may be our history, that today they are sovereign states and they are defining themselves in terms of their own peculiar culture, even if it's an exercise which is taking place.
Yeah.
So I, for one, have always been very, very careful in trying to tell a neighbor कि, if you permit me to say in Hindi, कि भाई तुम तो हमारे जैसे हो. That can be very offensive.
Yeah, very red rag to the bull.
That, I mean, if someone tells me from outside कि तुम तो मेरे जैसे हो, and I am a much bigger, and he is a much bigger fellow, I tell him कि भाई, what, you are trying to obliterate my own identity. So culture is a game which has to be played with great skill. And the way lies is that you have your culture, we have ours, there are commonalities, but you have your identity, and we respect your identity. And there is no desire to say that you are part of my larger cultural sort of in area of influence. No, you are yours and we are us, and we can see that yes, there are commonalities, there are affinities, we can build on them, we can have joint programs, but never try to tell a neighbor कि भाई तुम तो मेरे जैसे हो, especially if you are bigger.
So there's this other question of, you've written about it, this whole thing about intervention, in a neighbor. Say when things are perhaps so unstable that our own security is threatened, does that warrant intervention, and what kind of intervention?
I don't think India ever wishes to really intervene in the domestic processes of another country, because in the long term it doesn't work.
Hmm.
In the short term, it raises many hackles. There are two problems there. The first is that very often political players in these countries want to draw India in to get their support, get its support in various kinds, and that has to be treated with great wariness.
Hmm.
The second problem is when a political leader defines his entire political activity, his political personality, his political ideology in stridently anti-Indian terms. Then the question arises, how does India deal with such a political leader? Hence, I'm advocating that these countries and the political elites of these countries must come to an understanding for their own stability and for the stability of our own region, must come to an understanding among themselves that, look, we will not get India involved. Our games we will play ourselves, and we will respect India's basic interests, like we expect India to respect our sovereignty and not intervene in our domestic processes. So, if this kind of a situation prevails, and I think it can be fostered, it won't be easy, but it can be fostered, and I think that should be our aim in course of time.
Sound advice from a diplomat who has served in some of our most sensitive neighborhood countries, and keeps and remains concerned and continues to write about the situation there and India's own sensitivities. Ambassador Katju, thank you very much, sir. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And also thank you to our many questions from our viewers who have come forward, given their questions, comments, and observations. Keep following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and do visit our website. Ambassador Katju, again, thank you very much. Good night.
Thanks. Pleasure, Surya. Thank you.